Well, welcome once again to our fall series called Vision. And as we begin today, knowing that some of you have missed some of these weeks, as we begin today, very brief recap in terms of where we've been. For example, week 1 we said that we know God has a vision for our lives. Always good to come back to this, not just in terms of recap, but to say, gosh, I hope you believe that. I hope you know that. God has an image that He wants to place in your mind as to what your life is to look like. So first week we said, we know God has a vision for our lives, but if we're going to embrace that and discover that, we're going to have to open our hearts to God in some very real ways, to His voice. So we talked week 1 about some things we've got to do in order to sense that vision, doing things that we see Nehemiah doing in chapter 1. Week 2, we then turned to how, once we've begun to sense God's vision for us, now we've got to begin to take that vision and narrow it down a bit, define it even better. You know as well as I do, you might sense at times, I think God is calling me to do this. But you've got to clarify it more and more with God's help before you can actually begin to take action. So week 2, we said, here are certain things we have to do in order to clarify, in order to make more clear in our minds and our hearts, this is what God calls me to. All of that led us the last 2 weeks to begin to talk about this. How we must now begin, once that vision is clear in our minds, how we must now begin to share that vision with others. 2 things happen when we begin to share what we believe God has placed on our hearts. 2 things happen when we do that. 1, we're able to kind of continue to clarify in our minds through feedback that we'll get, am I on the right path or not? But the second thing that will happen is this. People will come alongside us to help us. When we share with others, we begin to get the support we need in order to carry out what we believe God has called us to do. So all of that leads us finally to this today, because here's where we turn our attention today, to now beginning to put our vision into practice. That's what we turn our attention to today. To get into this, again, we turn to the book of Nehemiah, and we're going to spend time, as we did a moment ago, in the 3rd chapter. And why chapter 3 today? Because in chapter 3, we find Nehemiah doing some really critical things in order to begin to put his vision into practice. Again, knowing we want to learn from his example, knowing that we must do these same things, let's take a look at these 3 critical things that he embraces. Let's look at these today. Here's a first thing Nehemiah knew would be critical when it came to putting his vision into practice. First, he knew he would need to do this. He would need to work in a certain order. Meaning the key question initially for him was simply this. Okay, God, I feel you calling me to this. I've clarified it a bit. I've shared it with others. I think I'm ready to go. Now, God, as I begin to put this in practice, what do I need to do first? You know, with anything we do in life, there is a first things first kind of process we've got to follow. Can't put our shoes on first and then put our socks on. We can't back out of the garage first, though I think I've seen this happen. Maybe it wasn't me. It might not have been my wife. It might have been, Can't back out of the garage first and then remember to open it, right? Got to do things in a certain order. Anything we might take on in life. And on a more serious note, it's especially what it takes when it comes to beginning to put into practice the vision God has placed on your heart. Now, before we get into how that applies specifically to your situation, I want you to notice how this applies to the work that God has given to Nehemiah. Again, let's learn from him today. Here's what Nehemiah hears God say to him when he asks this initial question: God, what must I do first? Here's what he hears God saying to him: you've got to first work on the gates, and then and only then can you begin to work on the wall. You've got to first take care of the gates, and then you and others can begin to, at that point, work on the wall. Has to be done in that order God is telling him. Here are some words from earlier. Verse 3, verse 6, verse 13, verse 14. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassanah. The Jeshanah gate was repaired by Joadah. The valley gate was repaired by Hanun and the residents of Zanoah. The dung gate was repaired by Malchijah, son of Rechab. Again, remember the very first thing Nehemiah does when he gets to Jerusalem. At night, he scouts things out so that he can determine, okay, what work is ahead of us? And while what he saw had to have overwhelmed him initially, with God's help, as he begins to sort through it, with God's help, when he begins to think about all that needs to be done, he's able to start where he needs to start, with the gates. Now, we might ask, why in the world does he have to start with the gates? Well, he needs to start with the gates for this reason. Because the gates provide a certain level of protection for the people, a certain level of security for the city. And only if they have that security, only then can the people truly do really well the work that they need to do on the wall. Hope that makes some sense. A few years ago, about 20 of us here at Beamer, we headed out on a mission trip to Puerto Rico. My first few years here at Beamer, we had a person on staff, Stephen Felix, helped with contemporary worship, helped with youth ministry, great guy. And his father was Puerto Rican. And so several summers we were able to do mission trips where we were going in and kind of working behind the scenes, not necessarily working with an organization, but working with his father and working with some others. This particular summer, one of our projects was working with a church that did not have a facility. And so one of our groups went in there to help them build, in essence, their first church building. If you were on that trip, would you raise your hand? Al, were you on that? And you worked on that? Yeah, we may not get to see. Jack, you were on that as well. Thank you. We're not going to get to see their pretty faces up here, I don't think, but I want to show you some images. Again, just like with Nehemiah, I share that work project for this reason, because just like with Nehemiah, if we were going to be successful with that building, we had to do things in a certain order. And so let me show you a bit of that work. So what you find here is that initial facility for this church. And I would say that it's okay to say, we're pretty far along in the process as you look at that. And what do I mean by, pretty far along in this stage of construction? Cement block walls are in place. Foundations there, cement block walls are in place. The roof is on. You can see that we've even painted a little bit inside. And yet, even in the midst of what you see there, there are some significant gaps. And they're somewhat problematic if we're going to move ahead and do anything more. The gaps being no doors, no windows. So at this point, we know beyond a doubt, before any more work can really be done, we've got to make sure that building is secured. And to use kind of the imagery we're looking at with Nehemiah here, what's it going to take to secure that facility? The gates must be put in place. And so here are the main gates now, so to speak. We have our beautiful doors in place. Don't know if either of you were on site that day. I do think we hung them several times in order to get them totally in place. You can see over to the side, windows are in place as well. Again, we knew order-wise, we had to secure this facility before we could get involved in too much else. Again, with anything we begin to take on in life, especially putting a vision into practice, with anything we take on, we got to work in a certain order. And so the question for you today, as you begin to think about this, the question for you today initially is simply this. As you begin to put your personal vision into practice, what do you need to do first? Or maybe let's ask it this way. When it comes to putting your vision into practice, what's the equivalent for you of the gates for Nehemiah? Might be a person you need to call, might be an email you need to send, might just initially be a reordering of your schedule, a reordering of your priorities. But whatever it might be, embrace today this first key thought. What do you need to do first? Here's the second thing that Nehemiah knew would be critical when it came to putting his vision into practice. He knew that he would also need to secondly do this. He would also need to focus on the principle of visibility, we might call it, the principle of visibility. And here's what that meant for Nehemiah. It meant this. Those who were working on the gates, again, key first step. He knew that secondly, when it came to those who were working on the gates, this would be critical. It had to be the key leaders of the city doing the primary work. And why was that important? Because when the people saw those leaders doing most of the work, that not only would inspire them to join the work eventually, that also would remind them, my goodness, clearly God is in this. Clearly God is guiding this work. Can you guess how things had worked in the past before Nehemiah got there and said, okay, we got a project here. Here's who's got to take it on first. Can you imagine how it had worked prior to that? It worked kind of like this. Those in charge, kind of pointed the way to others. Didn't necessarily raise a hand. Those in charge just kind of took care of themselves. What did that lead to? It led to a whole lot of apathy for the people in general. And what did that apathy lead to? It led to this sense for them that things were never going to change. Things were never going to get better. Again, how great it is to see Nehemiah just kind of stand this on its head. Because he realizes if the leaders take the lead, if this shift occurs, then at the center of the shift is not just going to be the people saying, hey, great, gates are being repaired, we've needed that. Instead, at the center of that shift, the people will be saying, man, look who's doing the work. And again, what's that going to lead to? Some inspiration, yes, but also perhaps what they needed most, a whole lot of hope. Here's verse 1. Eliashib the high priest and his fellow priests. Eliashib the high priest and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place. Hear that. The high priest and other priests. And what is that again? It's the principle of visibility. Now, I promise you this. Whatever God is calling you to take on right now, even as your work will impact the lives of those you're choosing to serve, even though that will absolutely be the case, remember this as well. Your efforts will also always impact those who see what you're doing. Why is that? Because that always will lead them, in big ways and small, to start thinking about the impact perhaps they could have in the lives of others. So ask yourself, secondly, today, if you choose to dive into the vision that God has placed on your heart, if you choose to do that, What will be some of the residual effects of your work? Whenever you step out in faith, and this is what this is more than anything else, whenever you step out in faith, people are going to be watching. Your neighbors, your coworkers, your children, your grandchildren, your parents, your grandparents, your friends, you name it. Whenever you step out in faith, that will in turn influence others in a positive way when it comes to their faith journey. And so knowing that, let that simply be another thing that motivates you. And then there's a final thing that Nehemiah knew would be critical when it came to putting his vision into practice. Lastly, he knew that he would need to leverage the good things that were already happening in the city, so to speak. Or maybe let's say it this way. He knew lastly that he would need to help the people build on the strengths that already existed among them. Here's what that ended up looking like for him, for them. He had people, lastly, now that they've moved to working on the wall, he had people, lastly, work on the section of the wall that was closest to where they lived. And while in part, certainly that had to do with kind of taking ownership closer to home, doing that also gave this to the people. It gave them a chance to build on the very good things that they were already doing, or it gave them the chance to leverage those things, we might say, that they were already doing in their own neighborhood. I thought it might be helpful for you, though I know this might be kind of hard to see. I thought this might be helpful for you to think about, to see to some extent Jerusalem in Nehemiah's day. Perhaps you can see kind of the breaks in the wall, right? Those are all of the gates that needed to be worked on. But then also notice just the length of the project, the size of the project. One estimate tells us that the wall at that time was 4.5 miles in length. And so again, what wisdom we find there when it comes to people working where they lived. Here are verses 4 and 5. Meremoth, son of Uriah, see what word you hear the most. So significant. Meremoth, son of Uriah, repaired the next section. Next to him, Meshullam made repairs. And next to him, Zadok also made repairs. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa. Normally, we would think, how insignificant is that word next? And yet, what does it do for us? It paints this picture for us, doesn't it? I mean, it gives us this very clear image in our mind when it comes to what's going on. Neighbor next to neighbor. Building the wall, caring for this project of God. Or even we might say neighborhood next to neighborhood, doing this good work that needed to be done. With that in mind, here's a last question for you today. Even as you think about what you most need to start doing as relates to God's vision for your life, even as you do that, also begin to think about this. Where are you already in your life right now doing some really good things? And how might you therefore begin to leverage that even as you now strive to bear even more fruit? I want to share with you in closing a thought and then lead you into some questions I want you to take with you again today. First, the quick thought. Do you know what name among all these darn hard to pronounce names in this chapter, do you know what name is missing? And I know how to pronounce this name, but it's not there. Do you know what name is missing from chapter 3? The name of Nehemiah. And that's not a mistake. That's there for a reason. That idea of where's Nehemiah in the midst of this. as he begins to plant this vision God has given him, as he begins to share it with others, and now as he begins to put it into practice, what do we find? Kind of that ripple effect. Putting it into practice in some very key ways that ignites the work and the shared vision of others. And so first, I want you to notice that. But then I also want you to do this. Go deeper into all that we've talked about today. Go deeper into this by using today's insert when you get home. Using it specifically so that you might keep these questions before you. Last 3 questions, bottom of the insert. 1, to live out God's vision for your life, to begin to put it into practice, what must you do first? 2, when you think of the principle of visibility, who do you think will be especially influenced by your following God's call for your life, and how might that impact their lives? And then lastly, where do you feel like you are already making a difference in people's lives? And how might you leverage that as you begin to take on this deeper vision that God has placed on your heart? Let's go to God.